You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us.
Hi everyone, I'm Talia, attorney and co-host of the true crime podcast, Crimes and Consequences. Listen to Crimes and Consequences to hear your favorite true crime cases, plus many murder stories you've never heard before. At Crimes and Consequences, we dive deep into the details of the crime, so if you have a fascination with the morbid side of human nature, you're really going to want to check us out. Go to Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, and anywhere else you listen to your favorite true crime stories, and subscribe to Crimes and Consequences, a hardcore true crime podcast.
Hello, you're listening to Fresh Hell. I'm Johanna in Austria.
And I'm Annie in America, and we are thrilled to be with you again this week during the season of spooky fookery. You just heard the promo for Crime and Consequences, which is hosted by Talia and Tanya. And what makes this podcast so interesting is that the two hosts have legal backgrounds. They're attorneys. So if this sounds like something you would enjoy, please go and check them out.
Let's see, what else do we have? A shout out to our new patrons. We had quite a few join us over at Patreon, so we decided to split up the shout outs. If your name isn't mentioned today, please don't be sad. We haven't forgotten about you. You will be in next week's episode. And one more thing, I caught an ordinary cold. My throat is hurting so much. My apologies if my voice is starting to sound weirder than usual. Also, I'm in another room, so maybe you can hear that. So everything is fucked for me today.
Everything is fucked today for me. I think I want that on a t-shirt. Just everything is fucked today for me. Same.
Annie?
Yes?
Once more, would you please tell us the names of our newest patrons?
Of course. Everything is fucked for me today. It's so good. All right. So huge thanks to Netta and the Moose. Netta, I need to know more. You know I also have a moose, so... Hi Hoof. Karen Every, Deborah Peterson, Stacy Swaney, Jessica Wolf. I don't know if it's Johanna Farah, I think, but it could be Johanna Farah. Hi. Lola, Astrid Maria Neer. Hi Astrid. Nice. Willkommen. Let's see. Amy McKnight, Kelly Coleman, Ilana Mears, Woody Cat, Punky Mose. These are some really fun names. You guys are amazing. We really can't thank you enough for your support. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so as I said, I'm slowly but surely losing my voice, so I'm beyond thankful that Annie is going to tell us a great story today, and she will do most of the talking. I'm gonna stay super quiet over here for most of the time. So what do you have for us today?
Well, I originally had something else in mind, and then because it's Halloween, I decided to look at a couple of cases that were the inspiration and fuel for one of the more popular urban legends, and it's one of the urban legends that I find the scariest. It's definitely in my top 3, and this is the legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs. Do you know this one? Do you have this one?
Well, we don't have urban legends like this over here, but we do know it from, pop culture, movies, TV shows.
Yeah, of course. All right.
This is indeed a scary one.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell you the urban legend for our listeners in case you don't know it. And there are a few different ways that this ends. You might know others, but here it goes. It goes something like this. A teenager is babysitting for a couple of kids that she watches regularly in a nice house on the other side of town. She puts the kids to sleep and is relaxing and watching television when the phone rings. She answers the phone, ready to take a message, and a raspy voice says, "Have you checked the children?" Startled, and now very afraid, she runs upstairs and opens the door to one bedroom, then races down the hall to the second bedroom, and she is so relieved they're both there, they're in their beds, they're sleeping, they're safe and sound. And now she's annoyed. thinking that it's a prank caller. And so she just goes back downstairs to watch what's left of her program, because this is pre-cable, and DVR, my friends, was not a thing. She's got a landline and 3 channels on a television with rabbit ears, and she has to get up to change the channel, but she is doing her best. God damn it. Just as she relaxes again, the phone rings, and she's like, ugh, hello, Jones residence. And again, that same raspy voice says, have you checked the children? But now she's mad, and she thinks that these are kids at school who bully her and they're playing a prank. And she's had enough, so she slams the phone down, then she calls the operator and asks to be connected to the police. And the police officer she speaks to has a kid her age, and he's very sympathetic. And so he tells her if they call again, try and keep him on the line as long as you can, and they will try to trace the call. She agrees, thinking this is finally going to put an end to this and get these bullies in trouble. So she mixes herself a fresh glass of Tang. I'm adding unnecessary details to make it less scary. I'm not sure if it's working. But again, the phone rings, and she answers. Hello, she says, speaking more slowly. Jones residence. May I ask who is calling? No, replied the same raspy voice. And then again, have you checked the children? As a matter of fact, I have, she says. Why are you bothering us? What do you want? And the voice replies, I want you to check on the children. And then she hears maniacal laughter on the other end of the line, and she drops the phone, really scared now. She runs to the front door, double checks it's locked, then to the back door. Everything is locked up tight. She picks up the dropped phone handset and hangs the phone up again, and it rings immediately. She picks it up with a shaking hand, and it's the officer she spoke to earlier. But her relief turns to dread as she hears him say, units are on their way. We've traced the call. The call was coming from inside the house. You need to get out. And that's it. That's the babysitter story. It's still so scary to me.
This is indeed a scary one. I honestly don't remember the ending anymore. What happens?
So sometimes it just ends there. When I heard it, that's how it kind of always ended. But then I know sometimes when the cop calls her back, she doesn't answer the phone. The phone is answered, and the cop just hears the maniacal laughter, so insinuating that the babysitter's already been killed. I know there were a couple of other different variations, so please, you'll have to tell us in the Facebook group, even in a review if you're not in the Facebook group. Just be like, hey, this is how it goes in where I'm from. Leave it there. We'll see it. So yeah. But as a kid, it was such scary stuff, and I really believed it was true. I did a lot of babysitting, and I was really happy when answering machines became a thing, and babysitters didn't have to take messages, so I didn't have to answer the phone. I was always convinced it was going to be a have you checked the children situation. And there's been quite a few films based on this legend. Most notably, there's many, many versions of the film When a Stranger Calls. I don't want to watch. It's scary. I don't like the urban legend. It creeps me out even telling it. But it's also the inspiration for the opening scene in Scream, which wasn't that just fucking terrifying when it first came out? I made Paul watch it not long ago because he had never seen it, but now we need to watch 2 and 3 now.
I mean, it was more fun than terrifying, don't you think? Great entertainment, though.
Well, I think the first Scream was scary for me. Spoiler alert, if you've never seen Scream, hit the fast forward 30 seconds. But the very opening scene, because Drew Barrymore was the biggest star in the movie, like you thought it was a film starring Drew Barrymore. So that opening scene when she's murdered, it was just like, oh, wow. It like put me on tilt, like I didn't know what to expect then. So that I think did make it scary. But yes, it is very funny as well.
Yeah, the opening scene was a great scene. It was really good.
It was really scary. Yeah. And so that made me think of the legend and how much it scared me. And I thought, let's get into this because probably the babysitter legend is going to end up like spontaneous human combustion, right? And I'll just debunk my own scary scenario, which is a bummer. But that's not what happened. So I found a lot of articles, and they all relate back to one specific murder of a babysitter. And it's credited for being like the inspiration of the legend and then some. And I think I'm going to have to do like a babysitter series, maybe the way you did the cannibal series, because I kept finding awful, terrifying stories. So yeah. But today we're just going to focus on the murder of 2 girls, actually, and there is a lot to tell, so I'm going to try very hard to stay focused. please pray for me.
Okay, let's do this. I'm here for it.
Okay. So, first we're going to talk about the murder of Janett Christman, and the primary sources for this are a 2018 article for truecrimearticles.com by Greg Barry and a 2010 article in the Columbia Tribune by TJ Greeney. There's another one I quote, but I've got that. I'll quote the source as I'm reading it. Lots of other newspaper articles. Yeah, I think that's it.
Sounds good. Any special warnings?
Yeah, it's going to be discussion of sexual assault, rape, and murder. So, all right. Charles and Lula Christman were a really lovely couple. They were married in 1935, and I have a photograph of them when they're a young couple, and they're fabulous. Their first child was a daughter they named Janett with 2 T's, and she was born on March 21st, 1936. A year and a half later, their second daughter, Retta, was born, and I may not have this exactly right, but I know that Charlie fought in the Second World War, and after the war, they had their third and last child, another daughter named Cheryl, and there were about 12 years age difference between Janett and Cheryl, the oldest and the youngest. After the birth of their third child, they moved from Boonville, Missouri, to the college town of Columbia, Missouri. In Columbia, Charlie and Lula owned Ernie's Cafe and Steakhouse. It's still there, and apparently they do an amazing breakfast. It made me really want waffles. And they have some original artwork actually on the wall. The artist who created the Dick Tracy comics used to eat there all the time, and so he drew a cartoon that I'll share in the Facebook group. But yeah, the family of 5 lived above the restaurant, which was a really popular dining spot back then, as it is still today. But having worked in family-owned restaurants, it's so much stress, but they were happy. So Janett was in the 8th grade, and she was a good student, kind of quiet, shy. She loved to play the piano, and she had some really great close girlfriends, including girls named Anne and Mary Beth, which I thought was sort of interesting because that's my name and my sister's name. But anyhow, the girls had gone and done a little photo shoot on the campus of the University of Missouri, which is it's just that act is such a nostalgic thing. You remember when like you and your friend would have like a roll of film that you could do whatever you wanted with? It used to be a big deal, right? And when you look at these photos, it's funny. Something almost seemed a little bit off, and I was trying to figure out who I was looking at and who was who, because I thought it was a mother and a daughter, but Janett and she's got a black poodle skirt and little bobby socks. She looks much older than her friends. She's taller and definitely has like a more mature figure. But then when you realize that it's her, it makes more sense because she still has a very childlike face. Right? So that's why I was looking at the pictures, trying to figure out who was who. But Janett was definitely an early bloomer. I was a really late bloomer, so I'd have been very jealous. But in hindsight, I'm not sure an extra year of periods are really something to be happy about. Am I right? So Saturday, March 19th. Yeah, again, this date keeps coming up, I feel like, all the time. Paul's birthday and Susie's birthday and Kevin's birthday. It's weird. It was a terrible, awful, miserable cold day. It was cold, below freezing. It was sleeting, which if you live somewhere that doesn't get sleet, good for you. But it's like freezing rain, but like tiny, sharp little ice particles that kind of sting your face. Unlike hail is more likely to sort of concuss you, but I don't know, it'll also cut you. And the wind was it was fierce. And there was an 8th grade sock hop that night. So I looked up the term sock hop because I knew it was a school dance, but I wasn't really sure, if I needed to know more about that. And the thing I learned is it was called that because kids would have to take off their shoes and dance in their socks so that they didn't mark up the floor of the school gymnasium. So that is some fun trivia for you.
I wish we would have school dances and proms over here. It looks like a lot of fun. But maybe also a lot of stress and heartbreak. I don't know.
Yep.
Here we have full-blown school balls with ballroom dancing, waltz and everything, evening gowns, tuxedos and so on, but no proms and no hop socks. But now that I think of it, hop sock, I just picture a lot of high schoolers slipping around and falling on the gym floor in their socks, right?
Yeah, probably. I'd have loved the formal ballroom stuff. That sounds ideal to me. I'm a terrible dancer, but what I lack in skill, I make up for with enthusiasm. All right. So Janett's friends, they were all going to the dance, but she was not. She had plans to babysit for a family that she babysat for pretty frequently, a couple called the Romacks, and they had a 3-year-old son named Greg. They had plans to go play bridge with some other friends, the Muellers, who Janett also babysat for regularly. Anne Romack was pregnant pregnant, and they had recently moved to like a small one-story house on Stewart Road, which at that time was a very, it was like on the outskirts, the western outskirts of town, so it was sort of rural and isolated, and they'd been really busy with the move. But knowing that she had another baby on the way, I'm sure Anne was really looking forward to just getting out and socializing, which would be a lot harder to do pretty soon, you know? So Ed picked her up, and once they got to the house, Anne went over where to find things she might need, and the baby was already asleep for the night with the radio playing in his room, so I'm sure Janett was thrilled to have this easy way to make money. You know, she wanted to pay off a burgundy-colored suit that she had put on layaway for Easter, which is... She seems like a very mature 13-year-old. But in addition to the normal babysitter chat, because they're the last house on a sort of like on a new road in a new subdivision, so they're kind of isolated. And so before they leave, Ed Romack says to Janett to turn on the bright front porch light if anyone knocks on the door and like, you know, open the blinds and look to see who it is. And then this part seems so odd to me. He shows her how to load and fire a shotgun that he leaves in the corner by the front door in case she has any trouble. I just think if I was like 13 and showed up to babysit and the dad was like, here, let me show you how the gun works. Like, I'd want a raise for starters. Like, I didn't realize that fire play might come into this, you know. In any case, Ed and Anne were on their way around 10 to 8 for a night out with the, I don't know if it's Mueller or Muller, but I'll say Mueller and some other friends of theirs. And it was a horrible, cold, stormy night. And because the weather was so bad, the police were just less busy than they normally would be. People sort of didn't want to be out in this weather unless they had to be. Or if, you know, they had a 3-year-old and a babysitter for the night. But at around 10:30 or 11 o'clock that evening, Officer Roy McCowan, he received a terrifying phone call. It was a girl or a woman screaming and sobbing, and the only words the officer could make out for sure were the words, "Come quick." But the line went silent before McCowan could get any useful information, like a name or an address. And because it was I couldn't figure out whether it was staffing issues in terms of the switchboard lines in that part of the state, or if it was due to a change, because around that time, phone lines also switched from switchboard to not having switchboard to like party lines. So the call, either way, whatever the reason was, the call couldn't be traced. So that had to be just awful for the officer, right? To know someone's out there who needs your help and you just can't.
Yeah, I feel bad for the officer. He did take it seriously though, right?
He did. Yeah, he absolutely believed it was genuine. He didn't think it was a prank. He thought it was real, and he just had no way to find whoever was on the line. Not long after the police get that terrible phone call, Anne Romack calls the house just to check in with Janett and see how they're doing. She also wants to let her know that they're probably going to be home late, but the line is busy. It's already pretty late, around 11 o'clock at night, and so when Anne gets the busy signal, she just assumes that a neighbor is using the party line, and so she decides she won't call again because Janett's probably sleeping at this point. Which, that was always weird as a teenager, babysitting, when a parent who wasn't yours would sort of gently wake you up when they'd come home from babysitting. And then I'd always feel really guilty because I was sleeping on the job. But really, you just need to be there, right? In case the kids wake up or the fire alarm goes off or something. But it was just super common, still is, I'm guessing. And it seems ridiculous now to feel guilty about that for being an unprofessional 13-year-old sleeping on the job.
I honestly ever babysat once as a teenager and it was bad. I had to keep going down to the basement to get firewood for the oven. And I mean, who really wants to go down to the basement as a 12 or 13-year-old?
Absolutely not. No, that was never part of any of my babysitting duties. No.
It so wasn't worth it.
I didn't babysit as often once I was 14, because then you get your work permit and you have to get a real job. But in hindsight, I think babysitting was more lucrative. Yeah, I think if you're responsible enough to do it, it's definitely more money than minimum wage.
I assume the phone was not busy because of the party line, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, the phone had gone quiet because she was being murdered. The Romacks get home about 1:35 that Sunday morning, and as they pull into the driveway, Ed is a little bit alarmed to see the front porch light on. As he's trying to unlock the front door, he realizes that the issue he's having is that the door was actually already unlocked, so that's really odd. But nothing could prepare them for the sight that greeted them when they walked into the house. Janett's lifeless body was lying, kind of posed, legs spread, one shoe on, one shoe off, clothes all bunched under her, as though she'd been dragged on the floor near the piano, lying in a pool of blood. Ed immediately called the police and a doctor, and Anne raced to her son's room, but the 3-year-old boy was unharmed and still fast asleep. The combined sounds of the radio in his room and the storm outside provided plenty of white noise for him. Now, the Whiteley family, they were the closest neighbors to the Romacks, and they reported seeing the porch light on that night, but they didn't think anything of it because Ed Romack was a tax accountant, and it was March, so busy season, and he'd been spending a lot of late nights at the office, so Anne would just leave the porch light on for him.
That makes sense, but they didn't see anything?
Nope, nothing at all that they thought was unusual or worrying. And here is what probably happened that night, based on evidence that was found and collected by police at the scene. This is one scenario. So, because the Whiteley family was able to see the Romacks' living room, they think the killer waited until the Whiteleys had gone to bed around 11 p.m., so there wouldn't be any chance of them witnessing the assault. So Janett was having an uneventful night, but she heard something a bit funny outside, and so she turned on the porch light, opened the blinds to look outside, but she didn't see anything, and so she resumed playing the piano. She had brought some sheet music with her to practice, but the sounds of the piano, a radio playing softly in the room, and the storm, she might not have heard the man who grabbed a sawhorse and dragged it over to one of the living room windows, the only window in the house that didn't have a storm window attached to it. If you're not sure what a storm window is, it's like another pane of glass that you put in place in the fall. It helps, like it's another layer of insulation. And then in the spring, you take out the storm windows and put your screens in for when you might open your windows when it's nice outside. Windows today have both a storm and a screen window that's like stored in the top part of the window, and so you just drop down whichever one you want. But I always break a nail trying to pinch the release buttons on those.
Okay, and the house was just missing one of these storm windows?
Yeah, that's interesting. They were missing only one. The order had been short one storm window when they moved into the house. So the killer uses a sawhorse to get high enough to break the window, which is 6 feet off the ground, and he breaks the window with a garden hoe and gets into the house. So Janett would have heard the breaking glass, and I cannot even imagine the disbelief and fear finding yourself in that kind of situation where someone's breaking into the house where you're babysitting. She runs to the phone, which is located between the living room and the dining room, and makes a quick and frantic call to the police, begging them to come quickly. But then, of course, the line went quiet, which we think is when she was struck in the head for the first time, but not the last. Blood was found on the walls and the floor, by the telephone, in the dining room, in the kitchen, through the kitchen, down a hallway, where she was knocked out or stunned for a time. The killer then went into the sewing room, and he used a pair of scissors to cut the cord off an iron. He returned to the hallway, dragged Janett into the living room again. Her gray skirt and sweater were bunched up beneath her, and in the living room, she was raped and strangled to death with the cord of the iron, and the killer left her posed, lying in a pool of blood for the Romacks to find. The autopsy confirmed the rape and that the cause of death had been strangulation. She also had several heavy blows to the head and lots of little punctures on her face and around her head by something small and pointy. Maybe a pipe, but they just couldn't say for sure.
It reminds me a little bit of the Bleistift murder.
Yes, it reminded me exactly of that, and we're going to talk about more of that in a little bit. And of course, Janett's family and friends were absolutely devastated by her murder. Her funeral took place a few days later on March 21st, 1950, her 14th birthday, and she was buried in the burgundy suit that she had been babysitting to earn the money to buy. It's so sad.
Ugh, those details make it even more heartbreaking.
I know. Yeah. So this is from T.J. Greeny's article for the Chicago Tribune. This was a great article. And again, you'll find links to all of these in my sources. So one of the women who vividly still remembers Janett is a woman named Carol Haley Holt. And she's interviewed in this article, and she remembers spending long afternoons singing with Janett as Janett accompanied her on the piano. And so the article says, quote, "Several days after the murder, Holt said she was called out of class at Jefferson Junior High by the principal and asked to accompany him to Christman's locker. She was told to gather up the books and gym clothes there and make the half-mile walk to Ernie's to return the clothing to Christman's mother, Lula May. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life," Holt said. "I couldn't talk, and she probably couldn't either." Some, like Mary Beth Boucher Jackson, said she couldn't stay home alone for decades afterwards. I was always so afraid, she said. Others said parents went to great lengths to shield them from reading the newspaper or learning any of the details of the crime. The murder marked a sort of end of innocence for Columbia. In a town of 31,000, where many doors were often left unlocked, hardware stores began selling out of deadbolts and latches. In a town where people knew each other's names, postal carriers reported that women refused to open their doors to receive packages. Babysitters became impossibly scarce on Saturday nights. The town and the schools were just traumatized, said George King, a classmate who now lives in Florida. They didn't do a lot of counseling back then like they do now. It was just kind of hushed. Kids didn't know what to say, what to do. There was a lot of hurt. Everyone was frightened to death, quite honestly. End quote.
Yeah. Events like this one are extremely traumatizing, more so, or I don't know if I can say more so, but a small, tight-knit community, I can imagine. And did they have very much to go by in terms of evidence?
They did. And I think this crime, if it happened today, would be solvable. So here's what they found. Both the front door and the back door were unlocked. There was blood all over the place, and in some of the blood stains, there were visible fingerprints in the blood. They found footprints outside the house as well, in the sleet. Bloodhounds were brought in from a local prison, and they seemed to catch the scent of the killer, but eventually lost it on the corner of West Boulevard and West Ash, about a mile away from the house, where the killer may have left in a car. I love bloodhounds. Chief of Police E.M. Pond ordered all officers to 12-hour shifts, and he changed the emergency number from 3132 to the easier-to-dial 112. It just occurred to me with rotary phones, 112 would be a lot faster than 911, wouldn't it? And he deputized a bunch of, prominent businessmen that he felt were trustworthy in the area and asked them to all keep a lookout. Police also felt from the beginning that the killer was probably somebody who knew the house pretty well. It's a really weird weapon as well, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely a weapon of opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. And some of the investigators thought that the broken window was a ploy. So one issue with the case from the beginning was jurisdiction. Because the house was on the outskirts of town, technically it was a Boone County Sheriff's investigation, but the Columbia Police immediately inserted themselves into the thick of things. And so there was kind of a kerfuffle over who had jurisdiction. And a fair number of stuff kind of went down. There's a lot more info on this in my sources if you want to read more about sort of the different agencies involved in their mistakes, I guess. But some detectives thought the killer had entered through the window, and others believed, because the front and back door were unlocked, that there didn't seem to be enough of a disruption in the area around the piano where the window was for him to have come through a window. The Romacs would also later say that they were sure that the garden hoe was in a utility closet inside the house.
So it sounds like someone who would be familiar with the house then, and someone who would know that Janett would be there all alone that night, right?
Yes, yep, exactly. And that narrows the possibilities down quite a bit. And so we're going to talk about the suspects, but first, one of the things that was immediately clear to police was the memory of a very similar rape and murder, which had happened 4 years earlier, only 2 blocks away from the Romac house. And this was the murder of 20-year-old Marylou Jenkins. Most of the information I have on the murder of Marylou is from a 2017 article for the Columbia Tribune by Caitlin Campbell and Rudy Keller. Again, you'll find it in our sources. So Marylou was a smart, pretty 20-year-old college student. She was the youngest child of Dorothy and Jacques Jenkins. Her sister was older. She had married and moved to Denver, and her brother had fought in the Second World War, and he now lived with their dad, who had taken a job as a plasterer at a defense plant in Kansas City. But Marylou lived with her mother, who was a nurse, in a stucco home that was located on the corner of West Boulevard and Rollins Road. And my understanding is that her parents were happily married. It was just work that had them in different cities, right? Not everyone is fortunate enough. It's not something you think of as being lucky, right? But not everyone is fortunate enough to pick and choose jobs to be in the same place that their family is. You know, sometimes you have to. My parents did the same thing when we moved, and my mom was still teaching, so. On February 5th, 1946, Marylou had been on campus, but came home to study for a final exam that was going to take place the next morning. Her mother had taken a nursing job that was at a house really close by. She was looking after an elderly couple throughout the evenings, but she could still see her house, their house, and so if anyone came to the door, Marylou was supposed to open the blinds, turn on a light, and call. And again, It just seems like a strange, elaborate system to me. Like, I'm not sure why you would... Why wouldn't you just call? Why would you open a blind, turn on a light, and call? I don't know. The only thing I can think of is if this was like a warning to let her mom know that she was going to call, so you'd be ready to pick the phone up immediately, so it didn't wake up her patients, and so that the phone call was taking place on their money and not her employer's. I don't know. I think you paid for every call back then, right? It just seems a little bit weird. So the only thing I could think is that Dorothy would see the lights on and know a call was coming, so she'd be ready to just pick up the phone real fast. But I don't know. In any case, around midnight, Dorothy noticed that the lights were on inside the house, but no call came, and so she didn't think too much about it. When she arrived home at 6 a.m., she was surprised to find that the screen door, which she'd seen Marylou lock the night before as she was leaving, was unlocked, but Marylou was not responding to her knocking. So she ended up breaking a side window and getting a stepladder and getting herself inside, where she was absolutely devastated to see her daughter on the floor in her robe and pajamas bunched beneath her. Her pajama pants were torn off, and there was an electrical cord wrapped 5 times around her neck. Frantic, Dorothy removed the rope in an attempt to resuscitate her daughter, but she realized it was too late, and the devastated mother had to call the police, knowing there was nothing else she could do. All the authorities worked together on this one. They still got it wrong, but the Columbia Police and Missouri State Police, they all worked together to get the killer caught. Girls were afraid to go out, hardware stores couldn't keep locks in stock. Same situation. But it's not good. So within a few days, they'd rounded up 20 boys, all young black men, and questioned them and inspected them for any kind of scratches, because Marylou had broken nails in the attack, and they felt her killer was going to have scratches on his body. A reward was offered, and papers were printing articles that the police were getting nowhere, and the pressure was building. Then, on the morning of February 23rd, 1946, at their Illinois Avenue home, Floyd Cochran shot his wife May in the shoulder and the neck with a 12-gauge shotgun. Now, I don't know if he meant to kill her, and I'm not sure that it would have mattered today, because Floyd had the mental capacity of a 10-year-old, and he suffered with mental illness as well. And if you aren't sure how serious his mental deficits were, I read that he had tried to join the Second World War and was turned down as not fit for service. I don't think they were turning many people down. Let's put it that way. After he shot his wife, he went to the old dump and tried to take his own life by drinking lye water. This is the part of the story that kind of reminds me of the Badger murder that we covered early on, because police actually found him trying to die by suicide, and they brought him in. And so his siblings went to the house to get some paperwork because they were going to have him committed to a psychiatric hospital, and that's when they found his wife dead. Unfortunately for Floyd, who worked as a garbage hauler, he had picked up trash at Marylou's house about 3 months before she was murdered.
Was there any other evidence?
Nope, there was not. That was enough to convince the desperate authorities that Floyd had knocked on the door to collect 30 cents that he was owed for the trash haul, and he then decided to rape and murder Marylou. Did I mention Floyd was also black? He confessed after a very long interrogation without an attorney present, and remember, he has the mental capacity of a 10-year-old.
It reminds me a lot of Brendan Dassey, right?
Yes, it reminded me of Brendan Dassey as well. So I had the same exact thought. And after he was arrested, black families in town, they sent their women and children to farms outside the town for safety. And the men made sure that they were armed enough to try to defend Floyd from a lynch mob if it was needed. It was scary times, but Floyd survived and was tried for the murder of his wife. He pled guilty to that, and he was sentenced to 15 years for the murder of his wife. And then he got ready to stand trial for the murder and rape of Marylou. And that crime he had recanted. He said no, he didn't. He hadn't done that. But the jury decided that he was competent to stand trial, which is a real who are these people moment. And I guess back then it was the jury who decided if someone was okay to stand trial. It wasn't experts that were making an independent determination. The jury was like, yeah, he's fine. Let's do this, which is... Yeah, Judge Walter Dinwiddie, he had actually insisted that black people be in the jury pool for the first time in the history of Boone County, but this will shock no one. None of the black people made it onto the jury, and he was ultimately found guilty at the trial, where poor Dorothy was present, seated next to the jury, and audibly sobbing the entire time. That poor woman, I honestly have just about as much sympathy for her as I do for Floyd in this situation, because both of them were really shamefully, unforgivably manipulated to suit the needs of the authorities at that time.
It's actually quite scary to think about.
It's awful. Floyd Cochran was found guilty of Marylou's rape and murder, and he was sentenced to die in the gas chamber. Today, this would never have happened. For one thing, there's absolutely no evidence, and it's also illegal to sentence someone with intellectual disabilities to death. We now know that false confessions are a very real, very common thing, which was not known, or they probably knew, but at least, it wasn't something the public knew, I think probably it's still a thing a lot of public doesn't know, but we know because we're into true crime. But yeah, his lawyers appealed, but they lost, and his execution would take place on September 26th, 1947. To quote the article by Campbell and Keller, because this bit is it's really beautifully written, and I'm not going to summarize. So, quote, after Cochran lost his appeal, the state moved quickly to execute him. For his last meal at the Missouri State Penitentiary, he ordered a T-bone steak, French fries, scalloped corn, cream gravy, bread, butter, cake, and coffee. He didn't eat any of it. The death warrant was read to Cochran at 12:01 a.m., and attendants put a blindfold over his eyes. Wearing only black shorts and the blindfold, he walked the last mile through a gallery of about 40 spectators to the nearby gas chamber. Cochran was strapped into the metal chair of the 6-by-10-foot chamber as two chaplains stood by. The doomed man asked for forgiveness for his sins. The pair coached him on how to repeat the Lord's Prayer, but he could not remember the words by himself. The heavy steel door slammed shut and was bolted at 12:04 a.m. Mr. Stewart? Cochran called softly, meaning Warden Ben B. Stewart. The voice was barely audible through the 3/8 of an inch thick steel walls. Stewart did not answer. Instead, he gave a signal, and a red lever on the side of the gas chamber was pulled. Pellets of sodium cyanide were tripped into a tank of sulfuric acid under the execution seat. 90 seconds later, Cochran's head sagged forward. The prison physician recorded the time of death as 12:12 a.m. End quote.
Okay, so I'd say they probably had just murdered an innocent man, at least innocent in regard to the rape and murder. Did they realize their mistake?
Yeah, I think they did. Not that they ever sought to rectify it, but unsurprisingly, after they executed Floyd, the rapes and sexual assaults were still happening in the area. And there's a great article by Craig Berry, and in it, he writes, quote, series of prowlers and peeping toms would emerge in the following years, and in the late months of 1949, the activity increased with a string of sexual assaults. The first rape occurred several days before Halloween. A 16-year-old teenager was babysitting on East Sunset Lane when an unidentified male wearing a white homemade mask with holes cut out for eyes broke into the residence and violated the young woman in the living room. The following month, on November 29, 1949, 18-year-old Stevens College student Sally Johnson became the next target. She lived 1 block away from where the prior victim was attacked and was home alone falling asleep on the sofa while watching television when an unknown male gained entry and attempted to violate her. Thankfully, she resisted her attacker and was left unharmed as the perpetrator panicked and fled from the home. On the very next day, another more brazen incident occurred. A college student enrolled at the University of Missouri was on a date with her boyfriend. They were at Hickson Creek, a lover's lane, and in their vehicle when a man draped in a white hood, brandishing a firearm, appeared and ordered them out of the car. They did as he instructed, and he forced the couple several yards away. He proceeded to rob and bind the male, and then he ordered the female to walk. When they were a considerable distance away, he sexually assaulted the female and then sprinted away from the crime scene. End quote. And so that last one is very Zodiac reminiscent, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely sounds like the Zodiac.
Yeah. And this time, they eventually arrested Jake Bradford. He was 23 years old and had been caught peeping into a window. So I don't know if there were extenuating circumstances or if he was a legit peeping Tom. He was given another very long interrogation, and he was convicted of the rapes. But the conviction was overturned when the appeals court found out that the officers who were interrogating him had told him, quote, they would lynch him like they lynched his granddaddy, end quote. Now, remember, with both Floyd and Jake, there was still full-on segregation, So, colored section, white section. And remember that it was illegal to marry someone white if you were black. It was a lynching offense. Sometimes people think that black people being told not to date white people is racist, but you have to remember that white people weren't supposed to date black people because black people weren't worthy equals. Black people weren't supposed to date white people because they might be arrested and lynched by the town. They would legally murder you for it, so it's not the same. And now we're bringing it back to Janett's murder because her murder was so similar to Marylou's. Both seemed to have been committed by someone the girls opened the door for. Both had electrical cords as the murder weapon wrapped around their necks. Both were raped and strangled, and they were worried for the first time that maybe they'd executed an innocent man, and maybe Floyd Cochran was dead and the real serial killer was still out there.
Did they ever solve either of the cases?
They did not. Marylou's case was considered case closed when Floyd was executed, even after the other rapes and murders. And let me tell you a little something about the man that most people believe was probably the most likely suspect. His name is Robert Mueller. Yep. Same spelling as the former FBI director, so I think it's pronounced the same. Mueller. In any case, Robert had known Ed Romack since they were in high school together. And then Robert had fought in World War II, and after the war, he worked as a tailor, and he was married with children. On the morning of the murder, he called Janett to ask if she could babysit his kids that night, and she said she couldn't because she was already babysitting for the Romacks.
Okay, so he knew that she was there that night.
Yeah, and I think that he already knew that. He was out with them that night. So I think he already knew she was babysitting Ed and Ann's kid. And he was also familiar with the house. And then remember, so he's a tailor because the cord gun iron just seems like an odd thing to get out as an electrical thing, right? Like if you're going into somebody's house, why would you go into the sewing room to get scissors and get the iron? It just seems so strange. But maybe a tailor would be turned on by strangling somebody with an iron, And Robert had been in the sewing room before helping Anne with the dress, so he knew where it was.
Yeah, the puzzle pieces definitely seem to fit. And he would know where the garden hoe is, and he would know which window had no storm window, right?
Exactly. Yep. And to make matters worse, Anne Romack didn't like him very much at all. Apparently, when he'd been over helping her to try on a dress, he tried groping her breasts. And Ed had said that lately Robert had been talking too much about liking young virgins. So that's always bad, unless you're also a young virgin. But wait, there's more. He called Ed the day after the murder to tell him how sorry he was about what had happened in his house. And then he offered to come and help clean up the blood. Problem was, no one had made it public that there was any blood at the scene. It had only been said that she was strangled. There was no mention of the blows to her head or the puncture wounds made by a small instrument. And speaking of small instruments, Robert the tailor was known for carrying around a metal mechanical pencil. Exactly the kind of thing that would make the wounds on Janett's face.
I mean, okay, it fits, but he had been out with the Romacks that night, so he had an alibi.
But he had been out with the Romacks, but when they talked to the police afterwards, they told police that Robert had left at some point during the night, saying he needed to see a doctor about one of his sons who had been sick. He was gone from dinner for about 2 hours, and so that was definitely enough time to have committed the crime. And when they checked up on the story and got in touch with the doctor had no idea what they were talking about. He hadn't been there. He hadn't seen Robert. So he absolutely could have done it during those 2 hours, because where was he, right? Like, if you're gonna lie, yeah. Ed also told police that Robert told him. He said something like, well, I might have done it and I just wouldn't remember. Who says that? And then the worst thing apparently is that this is the really chilling thing. He made a remark to Ed later saying, why would a killer bother to break a window with a garden hoe when you could just knock on the door and say, hey, Ed sent me to get more poker chips, which is, I think, exactly is what happened.
Oof, yeah.
Yeah. It's all circumstantial evidence, but it's so much circumstantial evidence. And they made some arrests. They were accused by suspects of beating people during interrogations. There was a lot of misconduct. It wasn't pretty. And then it got worse. So they finally felt like they had enough to arrest Robert. He was a really good suspect. And so they interrogated him, not at the police station after he was read his rights. They arrested him and then brought him to the outside the city limits to a deputy sheriff's house, like this isolated farmhouse in the middle of nowhere where they kept him overnight interrogating him without ever reading him his rights. And then after the all-night interrogation, they had him take a lie detector test, which he passed. And then when he passed the lie detector test, they felt like they couldn't convict, and that was it.
There's a reason lie detectors are not admissible evidence.
I know, especially if you're a sociopath, right? Like, super easy to beat. But it was still new enough technology at the time that there hadn't been any peer-reviewed, empirical evidence on lie detectors. So they really believed they were reliable. And that combined with how badly they'd fucked up the interrogation, there was no way that they couldn't get an indictment. They tried, they brought it before a grand jury, and the jury was like, no. Interestingly, Robert would later on sue police, saying they had slandered his good name. He lost that case, thankfully. And Janett's case is still unsolved, and I would argue that Marylou's is also unsolved. It's just so sad for so many people. So many people.
Thank you, Annie. I never heard about these cases, so...
I hadn't either.
You think this might be the origin of the Babysitter urban legend?
I think it's the case most articles about the Babysitter urban legend go back to, because I think it's the whole thing about the police not being able to trace the call to find her. So I feel like that's the detail that may have lived on in this urban legend, if that makes sense. The scary part is the tracing, right? So in the urban legend, the scary part is they were able to trace the call. And in the real story, the scary thing is that they weren't. It's just so sad. And I don't know. You just feel so bad for Marylou and Janett and for their families. They were just really bright, talented, lovely young girls, kind. They were just taken too soon and so horribly. And I just think about their families and hope they have found some peace. I think that both of them have quite a bit of living family. And they'll be remembered, I hope, for a long time. And please check out the sources. I'll share them all, as usual, in our Facebook group. You'll be able to find them, some really great articles. So thanks again. And that's all I've got. Do you have anything good this week, Johanna?
My something good this week is my bed that's just to the right side of me, and I'm gonna lie down now because I'm so done.
Oh, my bed is definitely part of my something good. So when I was talking about linen sheets a few weeks ago, Riley had pinged me and said, this is a brand that I use. And so I got the duvet cover, and it's so nice and soft. I love it. But yeah, my something good this week is actually my biological mom is here this week. She's visiting, and she's lovely. It's really nice getting to know her. And I'm really grateful that she and my mom got to meet, before my mom got too sick, because it was really sweet. It was just the two of them just hugging each other and crying and both of them saying thank you. But yeah, she's going to teach me how to use my sewing machine. And I got some craft supplies. We're going to get crafty, and we're going to decorate for Halloween. So I'm really excited about that. I'll have to take some pictures and share them in the Facebook group. We're going to watch YouTube videos on how to make bows. We're going to make a bunch of bows. It's going to be a whole thing. I can't wait. It's going to be great. All right. Thanks again to our Patreon members. If you want information on our Patreon tiers and what you get with them, then take a look at Fresh Hell Podcast on patreon.com. If you have a moment, please, 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 please leave us a review. Tell us anything you want in it. Yeah, until next week, stay spooky. And if you are going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Oh, we almost forgot about the dogs. Tell your dogs we said hi. Okay? Bye-bye.